Today we're going to talk about Chapter 12, Evolution. Explains the features of all organisms from microbes to humans. You can see down here the common ancestor of life suggests from this tree of life diagram that the three major domains, these two, bacteria and archaea, are one-celled organisms. They're simple, they're prokaryotes. They have DNA, but they don't have organelles, they don't have nuclei. They're huge. They're many, 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 many species. We mostly, in beginning biology, are concerned with domain eukarya, but you can see we all come back to a common ancestor, and that's because of evolution. Changes inheritable traits from generation to speciation, and those speciations has led to the huge biodiversity of life on our planet, not in human lifetimes, but in more like geological lifetimes. 99% of the species that ever existed or have become extinct. Speciation is happening around us in the natural world all the time. We're going to look at evolution and genetics together with classification to look at the major categories of organisms. The biggest one, most inclusive, are the three domains, and then we go into the kingdoms. We're going to probably most look at kingdom Animalia, a little bit of Plantae, kingdom Fungi. So these are genetics terms here. Allele frequencies change from generation to generation. So alleles are types of genes. Some alleles become common in others and less common in others. A lot of it has to do with the environment we're going to see. You can actually use this equation to figure out an allele frequency, and that's something we're going to do later with the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium models. In the population of Asia, frequency of alleles that produce black hair is very high, and we can use this ratio to figure out the actual rate. Population alleles that produce black hair is low, so the gene pool for Sweden could be said to differ from Asia. If Swedish people migrate to Asia and interbreed with local people, the allele frequencies within that gene pool will change, not in a lifetime, not over an individual, but over huge populations over time. Which of the following can evolve according to the biological definition of evolution? A group of fir trees in Oregon. B, Earth's climate. C, a single fly as it develops from larvae to adult. D, a fossilized turtle. E, a cell in your body whose DNA develops mutations as a result of exposure to X-rays. So a group. So these are individual. Climate is non-living. A group of fir trees in Oregon are a population of interbreeding organisms, and they can experience evolution. So all sorts of traits that are really visible. We can see differences between people, especially when they're from certain regions, and you can figure out how frequent those alleles are based on the traits of that region. Some other traits are less apparent visually that can also be tested. Okay, so the theory of evolution is ever-changing in our world, but it was ever-changing into the ancient world as well. So Aristotle believed individuals and species are basically identical and species are unchanging. We know that species now are not static. Actually, the biggest contributors to the beginnings of evolution were geologists who also inspired people like Darwin. So uniformitarianism is Lyell, and he talked about how processes in the past in geology happen in the ancient world as well as today. So this is an example between our pug and our dachshund who have been trained and bred for different purposes now for companion animals, but in the past for different hunting purposes. But if we like a trait of a pug versus a dachshund, we'll interbreed dachshunds with dachshunds and pugs with pugs, and like help perpetuate the traits that we find endearing. So fossil record is one supporting evidence for evolutionary theory, but we found that there are others that we're going to look at, genetics being one of them, comparative anatomy and embryology, how common species are as far as body structure. First, we look at vertebrates that have appendages. We're finding that like even the whale or the dolphin have the same bones that we do, but they're different shapes and sizes because they live in different environments and have adapted different ways of movement and living in that environment. But it all leads back to like a common ancestor. We're also going to look at how, I think if you take a bird, like a large non-flying bird, like the emu, the rhea, and the ostrich, they live on different continents, Australia, South America, and Africa, but they live on huge grassland areas. We found that they have found similar answers genetically to similar environments and being able to survive in them. So the advantage of being a large flightless bird in the plains is that you are tall and you can see far if predators are coming, and you have really long legs that can run very, very fast, and then you also have very strong legs that can, with giant kind of talons on the end, that could take out predators. So they're very well adapted to their environment. We talked about Mendel and inheritance in general now, and we've also talked about DNA, and then on into sequencing. And it's molecular biology and DNA that have really exploded evidence for evolution. And the more we found out about DNA, the more we realized we are very much interconnected. Everything on the planet, everything that's alive, is very much connected by our DNA. So which of the following statements supports the concept of natural selection? A, individuals with the traits best suited to the prevailing conditions tend to leave more surviving fertile offspring. B, traits that increase survival and reproduction in the current generation will be more common in the next generation. C, both A and B are correct, or D, none of these choices is correct. So both of these are true, A and B. So artificial selection is purposeful, usually often by breeders or agricultural farmers, if you will, selecting how creatures like plants and animals breed in order to get specific traits that are of interest to us. Natural selection is a natural process not controlled by humans, that is species reaction genetically to changes in the environment, and then mutations happen on the DNA level that may become a trait that is advantageous to their survival, and then over time and generations and populations, they may become a common part of the alleles of that population. So natural selection is the mechanism of evolution. It shapes evolution. It does not create alleles, but it selects for alleles that arise by chance. If in fact you have an allele, like our friend here, the seahorse, who's very well camouflaged in his coral environment there, this helps him survive, so he's going to have offspring, and those offspring, if they survive, will be passing on these same camouflage traits, and they become prevalent in the population. So, since more individuals are born than can be supported by resources, struggle to survive is inevitable. Some individuals, you could argue, humans for example, are very much better at reproducing and surviving than others because we use technology and medication and medical techniques to help us live healthier, longer lives. Whereas a dandelion just has to depend on the wind and chance. So an adaptation is a heritable feature, and it provides a selected advantage because it means that you're adapting, you're changing in order to better survive in your environment. Not because you want to, but because of mutations that have happened. So, dandelion may need wind to pollinate, which is a pretty effective method for them, but they also taste bad. So, after a while, predators learn that to avoid that plant because of the bad taste. This woman may produce more eggs than other women, which potentially could be an adaptation that would help her be more likely to reproduce over time. Bacteria undergo often what we call microevolution, which is evolution that happens in a shorter period of time, and we've all heard of like antibiotic resistance, and the fact that you take penicillin, which is very much prevalent not only in the medical world since its creation by the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company, but also we started putting it in animal feed, like chickens and pigs especially, because farm animals are susceptible to a range of bacteria, even though the creatures were not necessarily sick. It was a cheap way to get them antibiotics, but the problem was it became so prevalent in the environment that bacteria were evolving that were resistant to it. And if you're a resistant bacteria to penicillin, you're going to be the one that survives and reproduces, and there's going to be more antibiotic resistant bacteria like you. So the antibiotic becomes ineffective. Antibiotics cannot create a resistance allele. That variation was already present in the population. So nothing can evolve that's already not part of the genome, whether it's being expressed or not. It has to be in the genome to begin with for evolution to occur. Evolution is ongoing. It's not necessarily linear. There's lots of starts and stops. It happens over massive amounts of time. It can happen in one region more than another, one species population more than another. There is no ideal. And this is one of the major misconceptions of evolution, is that there's some kind of perfect creature for every scenario. But actually, if you're perfect for your environment, that is probably a likelihood that you're going to go extinct perhaps soon, because your environment will change. And if you cannot adapt to that change because you're so perfect for that particular one, you lose your genetic advantage and your species may become extinct. So adaptability is the key to evolution. There's not an ideal or super species. This is an example of the orchid and the wasp. The wasp is tricked into thinking that this is another wasp and it's mating, but it's actually just pollinating the orchid. The orchid does not evolve in order to be pollinated by the wasp, but neither the orchid nor natural selection has foresight. So this is not like a conscious effort. It happens through genetic mutations. But these creatures evolve together because they're dependent upon each other. The orchid relies on the wasp to be pollinated, which is its means of reproduction, and the wasp thinks it's reproducing, but it's actually getting food as well. But they have the same needs in the same environment, and they have co-evolved, if you will. Evolution keeps the best alleles in the population because the alleles that help them survive are getting passed on, and they're also being expressed because they give them advantage. So fitness in this sense is not like a level of buffness that you have, but is actually an organism's genetic contribution to the next generation. So are they giving the next generation alleles that will help them survive? That's a high level of fitness if that's happening. So fitness is reproductive success. So a species, remember, is an interbreeding population that produces viable offspring. Viable offspring are members of the species that can also reproduce and gives, and their offspring can produce, and so on and so forth. So fitness is reproductive success if these alleles can be passed on to the next generation. So how many plants require moisture to reproduce? What will happen to a plant population during a prolonged drought? To save the species, some of the plants will acquire the ability to reproduce without water. B, if none of the plants already have the ability to reproduce without water, the population might go extinct. C, plants that can already reproduce without water will pass on their alleles to the next generation, while plants that can't won't. D, B, and C are correct. Again, C, B, and C are correct. Plants do not have a consciousness to decide what they need to do to survive or to, sacrifice themselves for the greater good. But B and C are actual natural mechanisms that can occur. So phenotypes, which is traits that are expressed, physical traits that are expressed, they can be favored if they allow the species to better survive. So for example, our camouflage of our seahorse. Scientists can test evolution against a null hypothesis, which states that allele frequencies do not change from one generation to the next. So the null hypothesis is our control, so that we can see if the change we think is happening for the reason that we hypothesize or not, but it allows us to determine whether the experiment is actually valid. So this is a ferret population. You can see we got its dominant and recessive traits. Dark fur is the dominant trait and light fur is the recessive trait. In this population, it looks like the dominant trait is a little bit more expressed. 64 of the ferrets have dark fur, 36 have light fur, for a total of 100. And this is like an idealized model that will help us predict how allele frequencies change between generations. So the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is the unlikely situation in which allele frequencies do not change between generations. So it has tenets that we must assume if they're not going to change. Natural selection does not occur. No mutations. The population is large enough to eliminate random changes in allele frequencies. Individuals mate at random. No migration. So these are not realistic ideas, like things that are happening in nature, but it gives us a basis to compare like real life situations with. And it comes with this equation. We've got the alleles that are the total in the environment, that's the 1. P is the dominant allele, Q is the recessive allele, and then we can use this equation to figure out how frequent they will be. So let's look further into that. So since the D gene has 2 alleles, the frequency of the dominant allele plus the frequency of the recessive allele must equal 1. So P is the frequency of the dominant allele and Q is the frequency of the recessive allele. We can kind of set up a modified Punnett square where we look at P squared. We can see in this case the male and female gametes that are both heterozygous, they have a homozygous dominant possibility, and they have 2 heterozygous possibilities, and then we have a homozygous recessive possibility. But the 0.6 came from the 64 in the 100 population, and the 0.4 came from the 36, so it rounded down to 60 and up to 40 for the recessive versus dominant traits. So if we multiply the frequency of the dominant allele by itself, it gives us the frequency of homozygous dominant individuals, and that's 0.36. If we multiply the frequency of the recessive allele by itself, it gives us a frequency of homozygous recessive individuals in the next generation. And then the frequency of the dominant allele times the frequency of the recessive allele times 2 gives us the frequency of the heterozygous individuals in the next population. So how we got this equation is actually derived from this equation. If we square 1, we just get 1. If we square P plus Q, we get this equation here. So they're still equal. We've squared both sides, but it allows us to figure out the next generation allele frequencies. So Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is a useful model, but in real populations, the assumption of the Hardy-Weinberg are always violated. But it gives us a good basis for comparison. Natural selection and mutations do absolutely occur. Random changes in allele frequencies are common, and individuals rarely mate at random. There's always some level of migration between populations, whether it's big or small. So a population of 100 starfish is in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. The trait for long arms is completely dominant to the trait for short arms. In this population, 40% of all alleles for this trait are recessive, and 60% of an allele for all this trait are dominant. How many individuals would you expect to be homozygous dominant? So we would take 0.4 times 0.6 times 2, and we would get 0.36 times 100, we get 36 individuals. Oh, I'm sorry, homozygous dominant, we would take 0.4 and square it. And then we get 0.36 and times 100. We get 36 individuals. If you were studying a population over time, how would you measure whether or not evolution occurs? So you would look at mutations, you would look at allele changes as in frequencies and compare it in a lot of cases to Hardy-Weinberg. So natural selection can shape populations in many ways. We're going to look at directional, disruptive, and stabilizing natural selection, and we can look at them by how their effect on the population. So we've got directional selection, which favors one extreme over the other. With the moths here, we're going to find that pollution darkened the environment of London with ash and soot, and so that over time, as population grew on the trees and buildings, that these darker moths had a genetic advantage. They were more camouflaged in their new environment. And then we have our snail population. It takes a lot of energy to produce a snail because the snail biosynthesizes it itself. So it has to base its survival on, does the shell need to be really, really thick, or the color needs to be camouflaged a certain way. It doesn't decide which of these traits are going to happen, but their genetics are pushed by the changes in the environment. Disruptive selection doesn't go to an extremes, but it finds a middle ground. So the medium is the favored one here, because the habitat is not light or dark, but it's a mixture of the two. And then stabilizing selection is like the happy center. Okay, so extremely small infants and extremely large infants tend to have health problems that compromise their rate of survival. So the stabilizing selection is that there's like a happy medium. And this like 6 to 8 pound baby is probably the happy medium range in most cases. So to recap, directional selection favors one phenotype over another. Because of the pollution and the polluted environments, these dark moths became more protected and more camouflaged, and therefore less eaten. They reproduced. In this case, the snail's environment became a mixture of dark and light, so they became better camouflage and with a medium shell color. And then the medium-sized babies survive and reproduce more often than very large or very small babies. So this is stabilizing or centered selection. So why are harmful alleles sometimes maintained in a population? We talked a little bit about sickle cell allele and malaria in this area of Africa is very, very prevalent because it's actually if you have a medium form of it, sickle cell allele can actually help you survive because it makes you immune to malaria, which is a very, very deadly and prevalent disease in these areas because they're areas where mosquitoes grow and reproduce very readily and can cause destroy populations of humans on a large scale in these areas. But how does sickle cell alleles, how do they do this? With heterozygote advantage. Okay, so what is that? For the sickle cell alleles who do not have a sickle cell disease, they and are protected against malaria, but if two heterozygotes mate, their child might have sickle cell anemia. So the heterozygote individual is the most protected from both the disease and of sickle cell and malaria, but they may have a child with severe sickle cell anemia, which can very much debilitate their growth and development and cause pain in joints and muscles for their entire life persistently, because it turns their red blood cells and from the round shape into like a sickle thin shape that does not carry oxygen well and can be very, very painful and detrimental, even deadly. Okay, so as humans migrated out of Africa and towards Northern Europe, reduced exposure to ultraviolet radiation because they were moving away from the equator, selected for lighter skin color. What type of natural selection does this example illustrate? So stabilizing would be between like the middle ground. Disruptive would be a combination of the two. Directional would be an extreme one way or the other. This is directional selection because it's going from prevalently dark skin to prevalently light skin because of northern weather being less intense sun. Okay, sexual selection directly influences reproductive success. So, in areas where there's plenty of food, like the tropical rainforest, birds are fancy because they don't have to spend all their energy surviving. They can put their energy into fancy plumage and finding the right mate. Whereas you find in more like extreme environments like the tundra, creatures are not flashy and they're not fancy because they need so much energy to stay warm, or in the desert to stay cool and to find mates and to find nutrients and to find shelter. But in an area that has tons of resources, like the jungle, that's why they're more colorful, more beautiful, flashier. So sexual selection results either from competition or access to the other sex, like rams will compete for dominance for mating rights in the fall. And then the one male will basically dominate the entire herd. And these beetles are fighting here. This bird is building a nest to attract a mate, and this fellow here is going to do a beautiful dance to draw in his female. Intrasexual selection occurs when the stronger individuals in a population battle to win access to mates. The weaker individuals are denied access, and they become usually like loners. Sometimes they're killed in combat, but most often they're just injured or beaten, and they'll try again another year. Intersexual selection occurs when members of one sex chooses mates with highest quality features, such as the home here, or beauty and plumage and dancing ability. Hardy-Weinberg does not apply here, and evolution occurs. The stabilization, the population traits do not stay static. Competitive access to mates can lead to sexual selection. They can lead to sexual selection because not everyone will find a mate. There's not enough resources as far as food or nutrients or shelter or water, and so sexual selection will offer choices or competition in order that the strongest will, or most beautiful in some cases, will be the ones that breed. Mutations, this is back to DNA. Mutations create genetic diversity. They're random changes in the sequences of DNA. They can be harmful. Many are harmless, some are beneficial. When they are beneficial, they're passed on to the next generation because they've helped that individual survive, and then their frequency of expression increases. So genetic drift is random sampling error. Allele frequencies can shift dramatically and often become eliminated when only part of a population survives to reproduce. And then we're going to look at some things that cause populations to be separated from each other. So when only a few individuals establish a new population, the allele frequency might change. This is the founder effect because we're pulling from a much smaller gene pool. So the genetic diversity in an original population might be huge, but then if a small portion breaks off, it's much smaller. This can cause a bottleneck effect. If a natural disaster reduces the size of a population, and then the survivors may have just a smaller gene pool, less adaptable. So original cheetah population has 25 different alleles for a gene, but repopulation has only 3 alleles remaining. Non-random mating causes evolution to occur. So sexual selection and artificial selection can alter mating patterns in a population, preventing random mating because it's purposeful and favors one trait. Gene flow moves between populations. This might affect allele frequencies in both populations. So if we get our gray bunnies and our brown bunnies and they start to intermix, then the allele frequencies may change. Evolution is altered allele frequencies by definition. So we can see mutations happen and either biodiversity is increased or decreased to cause traits change, frequencies to change over time. So why evolution occurs when you bring home a cat to control the mouse population in your barn. Most of the gray mice will happen to be in one corner of the barn and get eaten right away, but most of the white mice survive. They were outside at the time, so you may see the white mice who have survived be the most prevalent in the future generations. Mice with large ears leave the barn and never come back, so that has taken that allele from the population to be reestablished, perhaps someone else. So evolution by means of natural selection has practical applications for things like fishing regulations. So we have been removing only large fish from the population over time, and that has changed the allele frequency of the fish. So researchers established 3 populations and applied the following treatments: removing large fish, removing random fish, and removing small fish to see what would happen. After just 4 generations, evolution could be measured. The large population, harvested population, had much lower average weight than the small harvested population. The frequency of alleles for large size decreased. Fish in the large harvested population developed more slowly than those in the small harvested population. The alleles, frequency of alleles for fast development decreased. Okay, so that is the end of chapter 12. We'll have a test on this at the end of this semester. Thank you.